Welcome to the Seafood Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jim Cowie. In each episode, we'll dive into the world of seafood, and by chatting with fishermen, fishery scientists and seafood chefs, we'll highlight the importance of seafood in our daily lives, economy and environment. Whether you catch your own seafood, love cooking it, or want to learn more about where your fish comes from, you'll find it all here on the Seafood Matters podcast. Today we are joined by Dr. Michel Kaiser, a marine conservation and sustainable fisheries scientist from Scotland's Heriot-Watt University. In this episode, we'll discuss Dr. Kaiser's research, focusing on how fishermen interact with the sea and the technologies being used to create a better future for our oceans. Stick around to learn more about the dynamics and complexities of marine conservation and the need for innovative solutions in this important field. This is Seafood Matters.
So I suppose I first got interested in the marine environment when I was very young, about the age of 7 or 8, around about the time when Jacques Cousteau was putting out his films on the marine environment. And that got me really excited to see this very alien world. And then eventually went to university and studied marine biology at the University of Liverpool. And in those days, you spent your final year in the Isle of Man. So literally you're living right next to the sea for the final year of your university studies, which was really very inspiring. But I decided at that particular point that I really wanted to go into research. So I started a research degree actually looking at the behavioural biology of crabs and fish, which is actually quite a long distance away from doing anything to do with seafood or fisheries. And you might ask what relevance that actually has. But when I started eventually working for CFAS, which is the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, and which was my first job, it turned out that actually my behavioural background was really important in trying to understand how fishermen decide to make choices about where to fish, and how management measures might impact on fishermen's behaviour. So in some strange way, over many years, I sort of brought back in my sort of early years of study. And that's really, I suppose, what got me very much more interested in working with the fishing industry. At the end of the day, the people who understand most about the sea are the people who spend almost 200 days of their year actually out on the water. And what I really learned very quickly after I started working at CFAS was that if you didn't take the time to listen to fishermen and think carefully about what they said, you were missing such a large part of the picture. And although the observations that fishermen come up with are not the way I would interpret them as a scientist, you can see what they're trying to say and how they interpret what they see. And that just opens up a whole new level of understanding to you.
What I'd like to do with that answer is I'd like to go back into a point you made at the start, where you talked about your time in the Isle of Man. In the Isle of Man, you were involved in a scheme called the Territorial Rights of Use, yeah? And essentially, that's giving fishermen ownership of an area. Can you explain what happened there in the Isle of Man? And I'm sure what will come from that is a series of questions from my father. But what exactly does the territorial use of rights mean, and how were fishermen involved?
Sure. Well, that wasn't during the time when I was a student. I was very young. Don't forget, I was only 21 at the time, completely green behind the ears. But it was many years later when I was working at Bangor University, and we were providing science and advice to the Isle of Man government and working very closely with the industry. So the Isle of Man is quite unique insofar as the fleet is fairly small. There are about 29 scallop fishermen, which is really useful because you can get to know all the individuals who are operating in the fishery, and you can establish good working relationships with them. Now, what actually happened was that in part of the Isle of Man's territorial sea, one of the key scallop beds in Ramsey Bay was completely fished out. And the fishermen went to the government and said, we need to close this area because there is no point continuing to fish there. It's just damaging the environment. And so they themselves actually requested the government close the area. So the government actually took the opportunity at that point in time to completely rethink how the area might be managed. And because the area fell entirely within the territorial jurisdiction of the Isle of Man government, they were able to create legislation in a way that they thought was progressive and forward thinking. And the head of fisheries policy, Andy Reid, who happens to be the editor of Fishing News, was the person who had the vision, basically based on looking at other management systems around the world. And what it involved the Isle of Man government effectively giving the fishermen a lease of the rights to fish for the resources on the seabed, in this case, scallops. So the fishermen were given the rights, the ownership, if you like, of the resources, but that ownership and responsibility came with a lot of responsibility. So there were conditions attached to the licenses the fishermen were given. They had to be part of the science. They had to take part in the surveys. They had to be part of the management and the quota setting process. But it was left to them to decide how they were actually going to catch those scallops. And what was really interesting was how in different years of the fishery, the producer organisation, together with the fishermen, decided on different ways to go and get the scallops. So in the first year, what they did was they actually chartered two of their members to go out and take the catch, which economically was a very profitable thing to do. But in subsequent years, they wanted more members to actually go and participate in the fishery because it was socially important for fishermen to see with their own eyes how the system was working, whether it was really being successful. What they've ended up with, though, is a system which is highly sustainable, reduces negative environmental impacts, reduces the amount of fuel they use, and maximizes the profitability. So it really sort of is a great example of how we could do things elsewhere around the UK.
But this was a scallop fishery, was it, of the Isle of Man?
Correct. Yes, that's right.
Okay, so what was the result on the procreation numbers of scallops once that scallop fishery was closed?
Oh, there's a lot of complexity in that particular question. So scallop dredging undoubtedly has a negative direct effect on the seabed compared to other forms of trawling. There's no two ways about it, but you have to moderate that in the context of where the actual fishing occurs. So in some areas of the seabed, the animals are very resilient and they can withstand quite a lot of disturbance from fishing. But in other areas, and we all know the type of areas that we're talking about, so where you have long-lived species living on the seabed, then the animals there are less resilient to that fishing. And if you do fish, then it may take many decades for those animals to recover. So there's no doubt about that. One of the key things about that Isle of Man fishery is because it was so efficient, it actually reduced the amount of area that the fishermen had to fish to get their quota. So that's a really positive outcome. At the end of the day, the less time we spend messing about in the marine environment, the less impact we're going to have on it. The other thing to say about the Isle of Man was that as part of the scallop fishery management measures, they also introduced some closed areas that were not conservation zones. They were closed areas specifically designed to enhance scallop broodstock. And what we do know from some of our other work, as you rightly identified, is that where you do have a closed area and you allow the scallops to grow undisturbed by direct physical contact with fishing gear, you end up with bigger reproductive organs. And that's because the animals that you find out on the commercial beds, because they're coming into physical contact with scallop gear, inevitably they'll be damaged. Maybe not to the extent that it will kill them, but if the edge of their shell is damaged, they have to repair it. And so that energy and effort they're putting into repairing their shells all the time is taking energy away that they could be putting into reproduction. So we found that scallops in closed areas were turning out a quarter more larvae and eggs than scallops out on the commercial grounds. So scallops are one of those interesting fisheries whereas fishermen might not normally like the idea of a closed area, it can definitely help to enhance the fishery and make it more sustainable.
Michael, I've been really interested in what you've said there, in ways that I could probably talk in the whole podcast about. And firstly, I was really so encouraged and liked what you said, just in the simple fact when you're introducing yourself, and that how you would listen to fishermen. And I thought that was so important, and I was so pleased to hear it. It was just impressed me, encouraged me, and I felt how confident it made you as in your role. And because obviously I've been over 50 years in the industry, and I've got lots of friends and who are fishermen. And as you'll probably be well aware, a lot of them, are very responsible, and that's very much, as they say, very much in their interest for the stocks to be sustainable. Now, interesting on the scallop side, am I right in saying almost similar in some ways to what you were saying there about the Isle of Man? Are they not? Am I right in saying they're doing something almost similar in the Channel, in the English Channel, where they pay a levy, the fishermen pay a levy, and their stocks and assessments and that are used? Because on the whitefish side, I was talking to a really good friend of mine who's got one of the biggest boats in Scotland just now, and as he was almost something similar, he says what they would like to do is maybe do it's a successful scheme that's going in Norway, where the Norwegian fishermen, they pay a levy, and that is used, that their figures are used as stock assessment. And the particular skipper I spoke to, as he was saying, one stock is monkfish, and they've been trying to aid the science with monkfish logbooks, to no avail, as their data was. I mean, you're saying how much we should listen to fishermen, and the government are saying its data is not seen as credible, and I think that's almost insulting. Well, it is insulting, and as fishermen say, why are we not wanting it to be sustainable? We've invested millions of pounds of our money. In our future, we've got, and many of them, they've got fathers, sons, and grandsons coming through the industry. So it's and I just wonder if you could tell us if there's something missing there, or is there something going on in between, because you want to speak to fishermen and fishermen want to speak to you.
No, I know. So let's put it this way: it's a very broad canvas, really. So you've got some really excellent examples around the UK of where fishermen are really deeply embedded in the science. So if you think about the pelagic fisheries we have that are mostly centred around Shetland, for example, they're very sophisticated businesses. They all understand the importance of science. They have their own professional scientist who used to work for the government agency, who actively goes to stock assessment working groups and feeds their data into that science. But that fleet is a little bit simpler insofar as they're all using the same type of fishing gear. They all have similar types of boats, and they even agree where they're going to go and take their samples from. So that's quite a high level of sophistication, if you see what I mean. Then you've got smaller examples at the other end. For example, the Cornish sardine fishery, which has a Marine Stewardship Council certification. And the fishermen were really worried that they were going to lose their sustainability certificate because of lack of scientific information. So the CFAS, the government science provider, didn't have the resources at the time to put into collecting the science. So the fishermen actually put themselves forward to be the mechanism to collect that data. They said, okay, what do we need to collect? How do we need to collect it? Where do we need to collect it? Got fully on board. But of course, there was a strong incentive for them to do so. With the other fisheries, I agree. I think the relationship has been one of frustration, largely for the fishing industry, because they're saying, we're going out there, we'll collect data. But actually, there needs to be an understanding about what the requirements are for data to be able to be used by science. Now, my big hope is that with the advent of technology, that it will make that data collection a lot easier. So I'm always very conscious. At the moment, we're doing several projects with the fishing industry. We're doing a big piece of work with the whelk industry, for example. It's very, very difficult for me to expect a fisherman to start writing down the numbers of whelks they've caught, the size of whelks they've caught, because the speed at which they operate is so fast. They haven't got time to do that. So we need to come up with other mechanisms by which we do that. And that's, through the use of cameras, not to spy on the fishermen, but to record the catch. And then, of course, using computer technology with artificial intelligence now, you can teach computers to count the number of whelks or fish or whatever, identify them even, and also measure them. Well, we're not quite there yet, but we're moving in that direction, more and more people going in that direction. At the end of the day, you're dead right. If you want people to have faith in scientific information, if the individuals who are affected by that science advice are involved in collection of the data, they are going to believe it. So it's about putting in place the mechanisms with the appropriate standards to collect that information. But the problem is that people have talked about this for decades, and they've sort of promised much but not delivered. And I'm saying that's, probably on the science side of things, probably lots of fisheries ministers saying, yeah, we're very keen for fishermen to participate in the science. But okay, that's a big statement, but you actually have you have to have the tools to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us, the audience, a bit about the technology you mentioned there? So you've developed a pretty interesting laser scanner to measure crabs and lobsters in parts of the English fishing fleet. Do you think that technology could be scaled down to the likes of whelks, so it's automatically measuring? Because, a fisherman's logbook just isn't enough. You couldn't build a medical exam based on nurses' observations or what doctors think or see. So where is this scanning technology for fish that cuts out the fisherman, if you like, but records the data?
Well, first of all, I can get a lot of information out of fishermen's logbooks. So
okay.
It depends on the question that you're actually asking and what it is that you want to know.
I want to know what resolution is this technology for scanning fish? It's good with crabs and lobsters. It can measure the carapace. But what can it do with, say, fish coming out of a trawl net?
Yeah, so, that particular device, that's not a project we're involved in. That's running out of St Andrews. Effectively, it's the idea for that has actually come from the food processing industry, where basically what you're doing is you're creating a three-dimensional topographic image of the animal. So in other words, the computer is reconstructing what the animal looks like. And as you say, with crabs and lobsters, the computer doesn't really struggle with identifying them. If you think lobsters are pretty unique in what they look like, and crabs are pretty unique in terms of what they look like. Of course, if you've got a big net full of fish in a massive pile all flopping around on top of each other, then it becomes a lot more challenging. So that laser scanning technology hasn't been applied to fish. What we're relying on mainly with fish is on video-based systems. The Norwegians currently have video fitted. They're trialing videos fitted into the cod end of trawls, so that they can see, if they're hitting a bad area of bycatch, they can haul the net, for example. My colleague Paul Fernandez at Heriot-Watt University has devised this technology called the smart trawl, which basically is a trawl with which has effectively an opening gate just in front of the cod end, and that's going to rely on camera technology. So if you see the wrong type of fish heading towards the cod end, you open the escape door, the fish go out. If you see the right fish that you want to catch, then the door remains shut. And that's all going to be driven by video images sort of interpreted by artificial intelligence.
Michael, how does illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, how do you account for that in stock assessment?
So basically, an estimate would be made. So it depends on how big a problem the IUU fishing actually is. So you have to remember that any vessel that's based in Europe at the moment, or the UK, will be carrying a vessel monitoring system, so which will be reporting what their activity is. At least it'll be reporting the speed of the vessel. Based on the speed of the vessel, we can estimate what activity that vessel is doing. So we know the difference between patterns of steaming. We know the difference between patterns of fishing. So that's quite accurate. But you're right. If you have a vessel that comes to fish within territorial waters and it's not carrying a VMS system, then of course you don't know what exactly it's doing. And if it's not reporting its landings, again, you're not going to know about those landings. The key question is, how many vessels relative to our own fleet are actually fishing? So, for example, if we've got, let's say we have, and I don't know what the number is, but let's say we have 100 whitefish trawlers, and you've got 2 vessels fishing illegally. Well, relative to the 100 whitefish trawlers, that's not very much. There's still only so much fishing those 2 vessels can do. But for example, if we've got 100 whitefish vessels and it's 50 illegal fishing boats, then that's a big chunk. So there's an awful lot more of fish mortality that's not accounted for. So it is a problem, but I mean, I think the key issue here is, what is the scale of the problem? We had the same problem 2 decades ago, really, with the reporting of bycatch. I mean, largely speaking, from a stock assessment point of view, the scientists would make an estimate of what the true measure of bycatch was, partly inferred from data they got from observers that they put on a selection of vessels. And we know, for example, that the Scottish Fishermen's Federation actually runs the observer program now. So that's another example of fishermen being proactive, being involved in the science, providing the observers. So at the end of the day, the better quality of the information that's going into stock assessment, the better the output, the more accurate the output will be. The more illegal operators we have working in the fishery, the more difficult it's going to be. There's no 2 ways about it. But that's not the scientist's fault, if you see what I mean. That's kind of it's a problem for the industry more broadly, in the same way that in the building trade, we have totally reputable builders, but we also have rogue builders as well. It's no different.
I totally agree and accept what you're saying, Michael. And the big concern is that fishermen, you're not getting accurate figures in your side, and fishermen are feeling there's a gaping hole and there's nothing been seen to be done about it. And one of the ideas, a lot of fishermen would say, we would love to see every one of them being stopped, but the more realistic and responsible ones would say, well, how about regulating the number of them that can fish? Because going by your percentages there, it's a big percent. It's a real big problem from, I would say, mainly from about the west of Shetland, at Deep Edge, right down to west the St Kilda and that waters. It's a real big problem and something that's really concerning the Scottish fishermen.
So one of the many problems with the way that we currently manage our fisheries is that we're not. When you allocate a quota for a large area of the sea, so let's say area 4A, or whether it's 7A, whatever the ICES area is. So the quotas are allocated by these very large sea areas. What that quota doesn't actually come with is any specification about where within that very large area that quota can be taken, because we all appreciate that fish move around. But of course, the fish will aggregate in certain areas, which is favourable for their feeding or breeding or whatever it might be. So one of the consequences of having this very large-scale type of fishery is that you can end up with very intense fisheries in localised areas. Now, if that happens to be off your local coastline, that's bad news for you. But it might be that the fishing activity is not happening anywhere else in that area. So you end up with potentially disproportionate levels of fishing, which unequally impact sort of local fisheries that we might have in the UK. So the problem is about the sophistication of the way we actually undertake our management. My own personal view is that Brexit did offer us an opportunity to move much more towards a community-based management system, where we actually allocate quota to communities. Now, you can't just exclude the foreign vessels, but what you could do is you could create conditions whereby you make it a requirement for them to become active participants in that community-based management. So, if you want to come and you want to fish, you've got to participate in the management, you've got to participate in the science, you have to show up and be responsible and take, your burden of decision-making and so on and so forth.
That makes perfect sense. And it's like what I always say, they want the schemes that work best is simple. And that's just...
How would a scheme like that work? I mean, how could you possibly petition a Portuguese trawler to start using Scottish government videos on board? I mean, how does that even begin?
Well, so the opportunity the Brexit should have handed us is the opportunity to basically create license conditions. If you want to fish in our waters, but obviously you would have to apply these license conditions to all fishermen, including our own. So then you're being equitable. Otherwise, you'll get prosecuted because you'll be told you're not treating everybody fairly. So, but you can create any license conditions that you want, effectively. So, if you say, okay, you want a license to fish in this area, you have to carry a camera. You have to report your VMS every 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever that might be. So any of those conditions that you deem to be important for vessels to be able to demonstrate that they are, playing by the rules, conforming to the regulations within an area, then you can stipulate them. I just really personally don't feel we've been ambitious enough. We're being very, very sluggish at sort of grasping this opportunity.
Well, and one of the concern with a lot of the fishermen with the current data, the way it's recorded, is that, as they say, that healthy stocks can be underfished, while stocks that need a bit of protection are overfished.
So we do have examples of stocks which are underfished. So you could say that's a good thing because you've got a very healthy stock. It's not going to be in jeopardy of collapsing, and it's going to be able to cope with climatic fluctuations. And but actually having an underexploited stock may not be the best outcome from an economic point of view or a social point of view.
There's a glowing example with that just now. You could say haddock in the North Sea. There's an overabundance of it, and they're very small. They're not fished hard enough. And you go to the West Coast, and maybe like a monkfish or a hake, for two species that are particularly targeted by this IUU vessels. And so they can be, stocks needing protection are overfished, while healthy stocks can be underfished. And it just seems to be, I don't know whether it's the system is wrong or...
Yeah, so fisheries is complicated. You have to remember we're managing wild animals. We're trying to manage sustainability. So fishing is so totally different to farming, where farming is just a control system. You know exactly how many chickens you need to grow, in 6 weeks' time, and then you're going to harvest them. Fishing is completely and utterly different. So first of all, as we've already talked about, we're struggling with imperfect information. We don't know everything. And if you think about how easy it is, for example, to do a stock assessment of wildebeest, let's say, in the African savannah, which is done every year. And how do they do that? They fly over the land in a hot air balloon, and they take photographs of the wildebeest, and you can count every last one of them. So there's very little error there, and so you can estimate how many of them are dying every year, and you can come up with an accurate sort of harvest rate. Of course, the problem is we can't actually see where all the fish are. So we never ever could ever count all the fish, for example, in the haddock population. So inevitably, there's always going to be some error in our estimate, and we can make it better if we have better quality information. So it's not surprising that from time to time we'll be in a situation where maybe we set the quotas too low. So you can set them too high, but equally you can set them too low as well. Because basically you've got a mean estimate, you'll have the upper limit and the lower limit, and sometimes we go too low and sometimes we go too high because maybe our estimate is, it's off the mark. Now there can be other reasons why that happens. So for example, in Australia, there's such a strong environmental movement in Australia that people are reluctant to eat wild caught fish. So there actually isn't the demand for it, and the government wants the quota to be set in a very precautionary way. In the UK, that's not the case. We let the science sort of indicate what the appropriate level of harvesting should be, and that should be, no more than maximum sustainable yield. So obviously, if you set the quota below maximum sustainable yield, you're giving the population a bit of breathing space, so it should grow much bigger. But there can be situations where you actually set the quota higher than maximum sustainable yield, and that might be because actually the biomass of fish, the amount of fish, is so large that actually that population can absorb a little bit of overfishing. And it may be desirable because if you didn't do that, you might put lots of fishermen out of business. So you're then going to create social and economic hardship as well. So it's this kind of balance about trying to judge, what the biologically right thing to do is, but you've got to take account of people's livelihoods as well. So you don't want to be sort of wiping out entire local communities. But you brought in, again, this idea of illegal fishing. Well, of course, that's another layer to add on top of that. But as I said, that is taken account of in the stock assessment. What I can tell you is that, about 10, 15 years ago, the majority of our stocks that are assessed around the UK were not in a good shape. Nowadays, most of those have gone from red to green. So so we're getting the management right, we're getting the level of fishing right year on year. We are doing a better job. But the other thing that most people don't realise, Jim, is there are hundreds of species which are landed in the UK, but we don't have stock assessment for all the species. There's just too many different types of species to do a stock assessment for, and because it's so time consuming. And the other thing, by the way, just to think of, is think about all the new species that are now coming into our waters for which we can have fisheries, like bluefin tuna, anchovy, sardines or Cornish pilchards, red mullet. Now there's a fishery. We don't do a stock assessment for red mullet. So, we're going to be up against this really big scientific challenge, for some years to come.
Yeah, and going on from that, Michael, I think, I don't know of any official statements about it, but I often, with my 60 plus years knowledge of the industry, I feel that Scotland must be one of the biggest multi-species fisheries in the world. And we've had ideas, there's been train of thought in the past, things like when they're, just regulating it with mesh size and letting immature fish escape, but from having a podcast earlier on with one of the earlier podcasts with Jon Christensen, the fisheries scientist in Iceland, I found it very interesting because one thing he says, he says if you increase the mesh size, he says that can have a detrimental effect as well, because it can be introducing a whole new year class into the fishery that all it's going to do is compete with the other fish for the available food. And the other thing that I brought up with him was predator stock, and we always class whiting as a predator stock. So if you increase the mesh size in an immature, with their being different sizes, and whiting are generally a smaller fish than say a cod or a haddock. If you let a smaller fish like cod or haddock escape, and a mature whiting escapes, the mature whiting would eat so that's counterproductive. But he said that he did stock assessment and studies in the North Sea, and he says the first thing they did was took the whiting and gutted them, and he says there were not one case was there any whiting that had any other species of fish in his gut.
Right, you're going into very detailed university-level lecture on fishing across the ecosystem. I mean, there's when you think about it, I mean, the use of a single mesh size as a regulatory measure is pretty crude, actually, and so there are some quite strong biological reasons why actually you might want to kill fish uniformly across all body sizes of the fish. So if you think about the distribution of body size of fish within a population, right, you're going to have lots and lots of tiny ones, as you've rightly said, and you're going to have relatively few very large, old fish in the population. So you've got that sort of pyramid structure. The problem is that if you let all the small ones go, you end up with a population that is very skewed towards small fish. And that also has problems in terms of genetic selectivity. You actually end up selecting for fish that will grow faster, will achieve sexual maturity at an earlier age, but they won't be as good at sexual reproduction because they'll produce poorer quality eggs, smaller eggs, and they won't produce as many eggs. So just to throw a curveball at you, here's another even more crazy suggestion. There's an interesting fisheries hypothesis out there called the BOFF hypothesis. So that's BOFFFF, which stands for Big Old Fat Female Fecund Fish. There you go. My undergraduates like that one. But the idea there is that your big, really big body size, old, very mature female fish will produce, proportionate to their size, far, far more eggs, usually larger sized eggs as well. And larger eggs are better quality eggs, produce bigger larvae than smaller body size fish. So you could even argue that what we should be doing is actually having a maximum landing size. So, for example, they have a maximum landing size for lobster. And the reason for that is to protect these big, old, reproductive females and males. In the same way, so you might think, well, how the hell could you do that in a trawl net? Well, of course, you can, because in certain fisheries, like shrimp fisheries, for example, and certainly in the Australian prawn fishery, they put in excluder panels, which basically screen out really large things, like skates and sharks. But it could also be, some big, enormous, fat old cod, for example, and scoot them out through an escape panel. So you let them live, but what you actually do is you focus your fishing more on the sort of the medium-sized fish, which at the end of the day is more what the market and the processors want. I mean, the processors usually want. The reason that processors like aquaculture reared fish is they're all the same size. So that's ideally what they would like. So it's a really interesting discussion point that you actually raise. The problem is that there's an awful lot of inertia in fisheries management, and for somebody to take that decision to use a different approach, where basically you land everything and you can sell everything, would take quite a bit of novelty. The other problem, Jim, that also you need to think about as well is there a market for that fish? So this is where so not only do I like talking and listening to fishermen, I also talk a lot to and listen to processors. At the end of the day, they'll bring you back to ground with a bump of reality. They'll say, well, it's fine, you can land that fish, but I can't sell it, so I'm not going to buy it. What do I do with it,
That is a major problem just now with the smaller sizes of haddock, because there's such an abundance of them. With quota assessment, we're separated off into different sea areas, and west coast of Scotland now and east coast. Now the North Sea is defined from something like the Channel, English Channel, up to north of the Shetlands. And there's a train of thought with a lot of the fishermen that maybe that's too big an area, and if there were southern North Sea, mid North Sea, and North Sea, because the Shetland, for example, in the northern part of the North Sea, there's an abundance of cod, but there's no quota for it. Now, no quota would indicate that the science is that the stocks are actually classed as less than they actually are on the grounds. But there's a real problem in the southern North Sea that there is no fish.
Yeah. So the thing to understand is that the survey for North Sea cod has been done over many, many decades, and it's been done right across the North Sea area. So it's been treated in its entirety as a whole area. So the data on which you're actually basing your assessment is also driven by that long-term time series of data that fishermen have been collecting for many, many years. Not fishermen, the scientists have been collecting for many years, but also taking on board all the landings from that same area. Now, if you start subdividing the area, that then becomes a problem for the stock assessment. So the way that you're viewing the population of cod is you're saying the population of cod in that entire area is this size or that size. Now, we don't know, as I said to you, it's really important to understand that we're not making an estimate of the exact number of fish that are actually swimming around in the North Sea. We're actually looking at a trend. It's based on data that's been gathered using exactly the same technique and exactly the same nets year on year on year. So we're looking for that trend, whether it's going up or whether it's going down. And also relating to that to what fishermen are landing as well. So again, the fact that the quota is allocated on that basis is a bit of a historical legacy issue. And so I think there's a valid discussion to be had about whether that is appropriate going forward. Do we need to change that? Particularly now. I mean, if you go back 40, 50 years ago, nobody was thinking about the fact that the fish would change their distribution to the extent that they have, given the warming waters around the UK. Most of the southern North Sea is not suitable for cod anymore. It's too warm. So, of course, the fish have relocated into deeper, and as have the haddock, into deeper and colder water because that's what they prefer. They grow better in cooler water. They do not like it warm. And, of course, what they're doing is they're leaving space in the ecosystem behind them for these other warm water loving fish like bass and mullets, which are coming in and then taking up that space. It's complicated.
Yeah, it certainly is. One of the other, I don't know, are you involved in going out with the survey ships and doing the assessments and that? Because talking to, yet again, I'm talking to fishermen, and there's two examples. Now, I know this is going back over many years, and you can't just go by two conversations. But if I was to say it, I thought there was, and you'll see the likeness and the interest. One of them, the conversations with a cousin of mine who is a very successful fisherman. All these days, he's been retired many years now, so I'm going back a lot of years. when he was the marine lab that was going at the time, and they wanted to do some assessment on and get to go out to sea with him on his boat and do some surveys. And he said to them, there's no point in going there just now. We won't catch any fish. Oh no, we just need to get the figure. We just need to do it. And that was a number of years ago. And last year, I was told that there was wanting to do some in Shetland. They were wanting to do some assessment on herring, and spoke to a fisherman about going out with him and doing some catches and getting some survey done on the herring. And he said the exact same thing. He says, there's no point in going just now. We're not catch herring just now. But no, they needed to do it, and they were going. So that makes that's another thing that just gives a bit of puzzlement to fishermen is what's this? Some of the figures assessed on.
Yeah, so I mean, the big limitation of a scientific survey is that you go out at a particular time of the year, you go to a location, it's one day in the year, and you take a sample, right? And that's it. Now, what the scientists try and do is they try and do that as close to the same time of year, same location that they go to every year. Or maybe we introduce a bit of a randomness to it. But typically, they'll usually do the survey either, say, in the spring or in the autumn, which takes account of species behavior. Now, inevitably, there will be some locations where they go where, at that particular point in time in the year, it might not be that good for the fish. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to sample all possible locations where they might expect to find those fish. Now, I agree with you. Fishermen obviously will know, well, if you go fishing to that spot, it's going to be rubbish. If you go over there, it's going to be good. The problem is if you only ever sample the really good spots, you would get a very skewed perspective of what the population, the true population size was. As a fisherman, absolutely logical, you only go where you're going to get high densities of fish. But if we only went there, we would actually probably end up, you could actually miss a large part of the population because we might only be sampling small amounts of fish, but when you add them all, you've got to add them all up from what you might regard as poor areas, but they're still contributing to the population. They can still contribute to the next generation. So what drives the scientists, what drives the fishermen are two totally different objectives. We need to make an accurate popular estimation. As a fisherman, you want to maximize your profitability and you want to catch the most fish. I used to have this classic problem when I was working for CFAS myself, and we were actually doing surveys of the seabed, but we would use the beam trawl to do that. And I remember on the first trip we did, and the fishing skipper, who was an ex-fisherman, he looked to see what the previous fishing skipper had caught, who'd been on the previous shift. He'd just come on watch, and he said, "That's rubbish." He said, "I'll get you a catch." And then, lo and behold, we had twice the amount of catch that we'd had in the previous tow. I said, "What on earth did you do differently?" He said, "I just put some more warp out so the gear dug more into the seabed." And we ended up with a big pile. I said, "Well, thanks very much, but that's not what I wanted because you've now changed the sampling protocol. I can't use that sample." Then I'd say to the crew, "Can you shovel that back over the side, please? Because we need to do that again." But of course, he thought he was doing a great job because to him, a big catch was a good result. Whereas actually, as a scientist, what I wanted was every time we took a sample, we wanted to do it in the same way so that we had consistency. So it wasn't about the amount, it was about being consistent. So they're really, really different objectives. And I think, that's why I got involved with Fishing into the Future, which is all about trying to enhance that dialogue between scientists and fishermen, because there is this misunderstanding. The thing that is really powerful, though, is when you take a scientific survey vessel, and this has been done on a number of occasions. I did this myself in the Isle of Man for scallops, you fish alongside a commercial vessel. Actually, in the case of the Isle of Man, we outfished the commercial vessels, in fact, sort of mile for mile. So, this idea that scientific survey vessels they're not effective at catching fish. Yes, they are. Just we do things which to the fisherman might seem illogical. The thing that we're not doing very well is explaining why it is that we do that because of what we're trying to estimate.
It's interesting what you're saying there, Michael, and I totally agree that it's the way the two different people are seeing things, because I know what you're saying about this, with the scientists to get the accurate and consistency, but and you rightly said, but a fisherman sees it that the way they see it, not trying to distort anything, but as you said, that they're looking to catch more fish. But the way they would look at it, and if they're fishing an area just now, they will not be fishing that same area in 10 years' time. And the area they were fishing, they are fishing now. 10 years ago, there would have been nothing there. And
yeah. No, I totally take that on board, and that's why the scientific surveys, when you see how many dots in the sea there are where the boats go, I mean there are hundreds, and the reason that we do that is to capture exactly what you're talking about, Jim. That kind of spatial variation that you get from one year to the next as the fish reposition and relocate themselves. But going back to the original conversation, this is why we need to grasp the technologies that are available to us to actually start using fishing boats as platforms to gather scientific data. One of the other projects that we're involved in at the moment is we're trying to build an environmental data sensor that you would basically fit to a fishing net. If you think about it, every time a fisherman puts a fishing net in the water or a creel, we're missing an opportunity to collect really valuable environmental data about, what's the temperature as you go from the surface to the seabed? How is that gear behaving? What's the topography? And, you would also get, how far did that net get towed, rather than trying to estimate it from VMS. Then once you've got that sort of information, which, you can literally fit it and forget about it. That's what we really want, batteryless environmental sensors. Then we can turn fishing boats into data gathering platforms. And then fishermen are really then contributing to a much richer understanding of what's going on. And to me, that is the most appealing thing, because the fishermen are at sea every day. We cannot do surveys, because you were making the point about the herring. To understand when the herring were going to be in that location you're talking about, as a scientist, you'd be doing monthly or weekly surveys in the same location just to see across the year what the pattern of the fish being there in a certain abundance or not actually was. But you're asking a very different question, and financially that's an impossible thing to do. Far better to get the industry to do that.
One of the things for so many of the things we've spoken about today, Michael, it fascinates me, and I find it quite sad as well, because it whatever is wrong in the middle, I don't know, but it seems there's a gaping hole where people like yourself and fishermen need to have far more connection than they have. I think that's just an obvious thing and I know there's will on both sides to have that. One of the other points I was just been thinking about as you were speaking there, and in my time and my age, I can remember two things that as far as the fishermen and where they're going to fish when we're talking there. Two situations that I thought were so similar, and I can remember it directly myself. After the Cod War, when we were stopped fishing in Iceland, and the Faroe government restricted us as well, and a lot of the mainly Aberdeen and Fleetwood trawlers, the Hull and Grimsby ones were the bigger trawlers that fished in Iceland and North Norway and places like that. But the smaller ones, based in mainly Aberdeen and Fleetwood, they fished the Faroes, so they were stopped. And the Faroe Bank was one of the most prolific fishing grounds in the world, renowned. And when they stopped, the catch rate, and I know this because I have the good fortune to do a lot of business in the Faroe Islands in my time in the industry. And I've got this from the Faroes themselves, that when the Aberdeen trawlers were stopped and the Fleetwood trawlers were stopped in the Faroes, the catch rate in the Faroe Bank absolutely decimated. It was dropped. And they were hardly getting any fish there. And the Faroese government were saying, look, we just weren't quick enough in stopping it. And it's seriously affected the stocks. What they discovered afterwards was the traditional fishing in Faroe was longline, and the trawls were much, much lighter than the trawl gear that the UK boats were fishing with the big, heavy rock hoppers and that. And they discovered that when they were going over the grounds, it was breaking up shells and rocks, and it was creating feed, and the fish were coming in to feed on it, and that's how they were catching them. And I remember as well, even on our own grounds and Murray Firth, the North Sea, round the north coast as well, some of the fishing boats, going back even when it was mostly sea netters before what is mostly trawlers, the actual fishing boats would be encouraging the scallop dredgers into areas, and they would even give them readings for that areas. And the scallop boats would be in there fishing, getting a good fishing of scallops. And after they left it, the fishing boats would go in and they would be getting lots of cod and haddock and stuff, and a lot of what it was in the belly of when they were gutting them was broken shells and scallop shells and things like that. So it's
sure. So what you've described there is glad we're not videoing this. What you've described there, Jim, is what we call in science a cultivation effect. So if you think about it, it's a bit like, when you see the farmer ploughing his field, you'll see a big flock of gulls or crows or whatever, going in and picking up the worms behind. So, you'll get the same thing in fishing on the fishing ground, just as you say. I mean, I've studied that myself. You get a really big, strong response. So, I mean, I've seen it in the North Sea myself as well, where you'll see the beam trawlers lining up one behind the other. So they'll wait for the first one to go through, but it'll be the third or the fourth beam trawler that comes in that'll actually get the bigger catch, because what you'll do is you'll attract the fish into the ground. I'm not sure, though, whether that explains necessarily why the catches went down. That fish stock on the Faroe Bank may well have been heading precipitously down an unsustainable slope because the fishing was, too much. But I mean, that's an interesting point in history that you refer to, because what always irritates me is that people don't think about history, why we got to where we are, and people forget about the fact that after the Second World War, we were encouraged to build fishing boats because fish was cheap protein, at the end of the day. And it was important to have that protein in the UK. The problem is we built so many fishing boats, nobody thought ahead to, the idea, is that the appropriate number? And then, of course, once you've got that fleet, you've then got that legacy, haven't you? What do you do with it? How do you keep it going? Do you have to feed it subsidies? And so because we didn't understand what we were doing at the time, we kind of created this monster, which has actually which hasn't helped the industry going forward into a more sustainable future. And it's only now, really, where we're really back on top of, the industry's gone through an awful lot of pain in terms of decommissioning and so on and so forth to come back down to levels that are more appropriate for the amount of fish that's out there. I mean, if you think about it, Jim, why on earth did we have to send our fleet up to Iceland and up to Spitsbergen, and so many lives were lost, because of vessels icing up? Why were we fishing up there? Why were we not fishing in our local waters? Well, basically because the fishing wasn't good enough. So that, in a way, tells its own story. But I mean, I'd like to go back to your point about where's this gap in the middle between, because we, on the one hand, we can see how scientists and fishermen have the same goal, but maybe there's that lack of understanding. That's why I think, I mean, at the moment, there's very ambitious plans for these fishery management plans. What that will necessitate is for fishermen to really be part of the process. Now, the problem is that lots of fishermen don't feel confident to have the sort of discussion that you and I are having in this podcast. So that's why I think, Fishing into the Future, which is a charity that was started by King Charles now, probably about, how old are we now? Something like 8 years old or so, exists to try and sort of give fishermen the confidence to feel that they're being listened to, and that they know what the scientists are talking about, and that's why I support it so strongly. And it's a charity that is basically driven by fishermen. Most of the trustees are fishermen, but it involves and it's great. I mean, I love doing it. Every time I go, I learn so much just talking to fishermen at the bar. I can't say it's doing my liver any good, but every time I come away a bit richer, not intellectually.
I'm calling back to what we were talking about with unregulated illegal landings. Oceana, they published 2 years ago that in the North Sea, every year, there are up to 41% of the catch being illegally caught by foreign fishing vessels. That's not 6, that's not 12 or 11, that's almost 50%. You, Michael, I bet you don't use 50% in your stock evaluations to account for illegal landings. So surely the fishermen have a real problem accepting that anybody has their finger on the pulse to do with quotas and landings. With an estimated 41% illegal landings, can you understand how fishermen might not trust that the Scottish government and the scientists who feed the information to the Scottish government have a finger on the pulse? Wouldn't you identify these illegal landings as the number one biggest block between science and the fishermen?
So, as a scientist, you'll understand I'm very sceptical about anything I hear. I'm usually quite sceptical of anything that I hear from Oceana. They have an agenda, so I haven't seen that. I'd want to look to see where they're getting their data from. All I can tell you is that we had a really big problem in the UK with blackfish landings. We know that. You talk to anybody in the industry, everybody was well aware of blackfish landings. So the industry were themselves the largest part to blame for misreporting of landings of fish. We all know about what was going on in the pelagic fleet. And, I was a Seafish board member at the time when we were sort of raided by Grampian police. That was a great introduction to being on a board. Day 18, we've been raided by Grampian police. Thank you for that one. So the thing that made the biggest difference there, though, was the introduction of buyers and sellers legislation. So I would say in the UK now, the only people who are kind of getting away with illegal landings will be relatively small scale fishers who can just do a bit of backdoor sales with a pub. But I mean, of course, the fact that if you get caught now, that's fraud as opposed to a civil offence. It's a prison sentence. Pretty much overnight, reduce that down to a negligible level in the UK. Now, if there are vessels which are not, fishing under European jurisdiction, coming in, then you've got to question why. So I don't know, and I don't know any details about that. If they are fishing illegally, then you have to say, well, why are the authority? One of the key components of sustainable fisheries is enforcement. And actually, fishermen like enforcement because if they see effective enforcement, it means that everybody's playing to a level playing field. Now, if somebody is getting away with illegal fishing, that just completely undermines your faith and confidence in the system. So I must admit, I've not followed that. I'm not aware of it. But then the question has to be to the minister: why are we not effectively sort of drilling down on this?
That is the question being asked. So, for example, Fishing Forward UK and Shetland have a conglomeration of processors and fishing boats, and on their homepage they declare that the biggest issue they're facing today is the amount of unregulated, by the hundreds a year, tonnages of fish being landed by foreign fishing vessels, completely unmonitored. It's surprising to hear you're not aware of this enormous issue, because it is a massive issue. We're not talking about boats landing and selling to pubs at night. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of tons of fish being landed, unmonitored, unaccounted for by you. So fishermen are seeing this.
No, I'm sorry. I mean, you're hanging responsibility for all fisheries science on the head of one person. So number one, I don't do stock assessment.
Who does that?
So yeah, I mean, so basically, in the UK, we have the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, who are responsible for delivering our stock assessment advice for England and Wales. We have scientists in Wales, Bangor University, providing stock assessments on sort of crab and scallops. In Scotland, it's Marine Science, of course, that's responsible for feeding in on the stock assessments. And in Northern Ireland, they have their own team of scientists. But, there's only so much science I can deal with. And I'm afraid that one is out of scope for me. So, I'm not an expert on that area. And there's, there's only so much I can do. And what I focus on is more on the interaction between fishing and the marine environment, and really thinking more about alternative management systems.
Ashley, let me come in. I know Michael is more than capable of talking for himself and looking after himself, but let me tell you, as far as what you're talking about there, enforcement, the unrecorded, unmonitored landings of the foreign boats that you're talking about, is 100% directly on the lap of Marine Scotland's enforcement team, and they are not doing it. And even I know I could put you could speak to hundreds of fishermen who even speak to Marine Scotland themselves and say, why do you monitor me and not the person alongside me?
That's what I'm asking. So your answer is Marine Scotland.
Well, again, so the answer to that is it comes down to how big a problem is it. So if you have an estimate of how big a problem it is, then you can factor it in. But I totally agree with you. I've had plenty of experience in the past of being contacted, rung up, texted, WhatsApped by fishermen saying, I'm sitting outside this protected area, I can see lights in the area, I'm following him on my radar, and I know this guy is fishing. Oh, and by the way, the enforcement team have just boarded me and they're looking at my meshes while ignoring this quite clearly illegally fishing boat, which was in fact another UK vessel. So it's ridiculous. We have in some sectors, we've got, unfortunately, officials who are paid to be enforcement officers who pretty much don't like confrontation and don't, so I'll do my job, I'll board this number of vessels, but, I mean, there was one time when my own scientists actually were photographing an illegally fishing boat off the stern of a boat, which eventually that went as evidence to court. But I mean, how ridiculous. We phoned it in. Did the enforcement team come out and get them? No. So, and then, in response to that, there would be all sorts of plenty of excuses. Oh, the engine wasn't working. Oh, it was a weekend. We were off duty. You name it. It's as long, So if we're going to have enforcement, let's do it properly, or it's not bothering.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think enforcement is the key to you guys tightening up on what your findings are. If you have all the data, if you like, if you have a partial
Actually,
data.
you've got to remember that enforcement has nothing to do with science, and science has nothing to do with enforcement. They are two totally separate things. And and if I was part of the enforcement side of things, you would never talk to me as a fisherman. Why would you? I wouldn't.
But the likes of Oceania, so you reckon that these figures being thrown around 41% overfishing?
No, the point is, actually, I can't comment on their validity because I haven't seen them. I don't know where they've got them from, so I can make no comment about that. I'll tell you the most effective way to enforce things is when the industry actually enforces things themselves. The French are really good at this because the French tend to work in a very cooperative way. So they form themselves into these cooperatives. They have really strict rules whereby, if somebody breaks the rules, well, they're prevented from fishing for a day. Break them again, they're prevented from fishing for a week. Break them again, then they're kicked out for a year. Break them again, then they have their license removed. And it's the fishermen which actually impose that themselves. There's nothing better than your fellow, tradesmen, fishermen, actually enforcing the regulations.
Is that what happens in Africa? Because they seem to have a really tight fisheries management system.
I've no idea. I couldn't comment in Africa. Certainly in other parts of the world, like Fiji, where you have these very traditional fishery management systems that have come up. Yeah, you would be ostracised from your community. You wouldn't be allowed to have access. Pretty much, the French are doing it in the same sort of way. But I think a great example in the UK is down in the English Channel, where UK fishermen get together with the French and the Belgians, and they work out how to use different bits of the English Channel so they don't come into conflict with each other. Everyone's always saying, "Oh, fishermen don't get on; they can't agree anything." Well, guess what? Yeah, actually, they can, and they've been doing that for decades.
But do you not feel as well, Michael, that by the way, I totally accept your comment about Oceania. They have an agenda, but do you not feel that's very similar for all the other NGOs and organizations that talk about saving the planet and all that they have agendas and they raise a lot of, they're money-making machines, as I would call them, and it's really unfair how, even when I had the restaurant, you would get people coming in and saying, "Oh, I can't have this cod because it's not sustainable." I says, "Yes, it is."
Yeah, you're right. The fishing industry, certainly in the UK, is actually quite small. You've got to probably most fishermen in the UK, probably don't realise just how small an industry it is. I think we've got something like 14,000 boats in the UK, 5,000 boats, something like that. I don't know. Maybe it might be a bit more, maybe 10,000. I went to a meeting not so many years ago. We had a scientist over from Kerala state in India, one state in India, 30,000 trawlers in one state. So our industry is actually pretty small. And the other problem with our industry as well is it's very fragmented. So you've got lots of fishermen who don't like to be part of a PO. They just like to be single operators. But actually, being divided is not very effective. The more that fishermen could act with one voice, the more effectively they would actually be heard. Because what you're up against is a torrent of negative media, because it's very easy to throw rocks at the fishing industry, and of course, you've got things like Blue Planet, which are showing people, how wonderful and precious, the marine environment is. So at the end of the day, the industry is facing a very sophisticated, very professional, very media savvy machine, and you are very much up against it. But the corollary to that is you can be heroes as well. Look at Jimmy Buchan, 2 offers of marriage after the series he was featured in. And, you got the world's wildest fishery, the king crab fishery over in Bering Sea, huge viewing figures because, people appreciate what a tough and dangerous existence it is. So fishing is a bit sort of yin and yang, isn't it? On the one hand, people love it. On the other hand, people don't like it. And there's an awful lot of misinformation out there. But the industry doesn't help itself when it is divided. And the greater cohesion it could have, the better it would be, I think.
I agree with that. And Michael, I think, Ashley, in our conversation yesterday, I think you nailed it as far as that's concerned, with why one of the reasons why that's the case is because the fishing industry is an easy target.
You can't touch cows, pigs, or chickens. They're an industry that has so much more, I don't know, financial investment, if you like. But the fishing industry, as you say, it suits fine that they're disparate and broken with lots of different compartments, because it's easier to attack a broken army than it is to attack an entire legion, isn't it? And I think that comes through. I think as well what a lot of people forget is we talk about the fishing industry, and Michael, it was maybe your research I read this from, but we forget that 80% of the fishing industry are people in canoes, right? Around the world. These are people in dugout boats with maybe 2 people on board, like at the vast majority. So I think it's really important, as you said, to break it down into sea areas, maybe not just as big as we have now, but it's being nuanced about the whole thing. Oceania, to talk about the North Sea, 41% overfishing. These are swooping anecdotal guesses. And I think the efforts that you've explained and the technologies that are being created, Michael, I think that shows hope for the future of an industry that is contracting like it's never contracted before. And I do believe technology, if the fishermen would give over to the technology, the cameras on the boats, the laser filming, it could start to make a big difference, because there is just a massive gulf in facts. You are providing what's closest to facts because it's from repeated scientific data sets, but the fishermen are in a world of anecdotal experience with no access to actual facts. I bet you 70% of the fishermen listening to this podcast don't know that you or your job actually exists. They know who Marine Scotland is because they're the identified devil that's not doing their jobs. So, yeah, if nothing else, you've pointed out that the communication between fishermen and scientists needs to come closer. And I think that's really encouraging, because the technologies are there. It's just how it can be adapted, I suppose, to monitoring.
Yeah, so the other thing that you need to realise is that the science community is not a uniform. We're not all angels, arrayed up in heaven with white wings. There are some people that also, as a scientist, my view is that my duty is to report facts as they are, and to interpret those facts in a way that is genuine without any sort of loading on those facts. But there are people that do not conform to those ethics, who do actually have agendas, who do have track records of drawing down lots of money from the Oceanas of the world and the funders of Oceania, for example. And inevitably, there will be a tendency to look for the result. What's the result we're looking for? Let's now find the evidence to support that result. And that is absolutely poor practice. But unfortunately, you have to realise that happens. And I have to say, just from a personal perspective, that is the one thing that pisses me off more than anything else. So the one thing I get angry about is when I see misinformation and distorted and biased reporting. And so, but I would say that the vast majority of us are actually robust. We all get angry about this. We all see these headline publications like the one recently that said that the fishing industry was contributing more to carbon dioxide emissions than the airline industry in the world. It's absolute nonsense, full of errors. The only thing we could do was, collectively write what we call a rebuttal. So that's like an objection to that paper coming out. But guess what? What's all the media reporting? They're still picking up that paper, even though we rubbished it. The damage is done. So, it takes an awful lot of effort to undo bullshit.
A lie travels around the world twice before the truth has even got its trousers on. Yeah? And you see it with posts on social media. You'll see somebody making the most outrageous claim, and it'll get 3 million views, and then you'll see the rebuttal or the edit saying, we're sorry it was wrong, and it'll get 12,000. That's the world we live in. That's what you essentially are fighting against. It's the most frustrating thing, and it happens in every sector.
Sure.
Is the need, the profit generated by the headline compared to the reality faced by the people.
I know, and to be quite frank, it's a sad place that we've got to. Nevertheless, that doesn't deter me from pursuing the truth, and I intend to continue doing that with fishermen.
You did stuff on the impact of trawling and scallop dredging on the seabed.
For many years, 30 years of my life.
I know, well, a lot of scallop dredgers would say, one in particular who I'm really good friends with, as he says that, well, two things he says, three things I'll tell you he says. One is, well, what's a farmer's field, like you mentioned earlier, what's a farmer's field like if he doesn't plough it? And he reckons that his wife does more damage to the wildlife when she takes a strimmer around the garden than when he's scallop dredging. And the other thing he says that he'll go around completely around the British Isles over the course of a year, and he's been doing that for over 40 years now. So what's not sustainable about that?
Well, so bottom trawling is very controversial. There are lots of people who would like to ban it at the moment. I don't fall into that camp. I think the thing that people lose sight of is that bottom trawling, including scallop dredging as well, contributes a quarter of all seafood landed in the world at the moment. So if you turn that off overnight, you would be losing 20 million tons of food production of very valuable and very healthy protein that people consume. So the idea that you could just stop doing that is nonsense. I mean, so my first job after coming out of university was to understand better exactly what beam trawling does to the seabed, and that sort of then branched out into scallop dredging. And of course, any you've got to start with the premise that any fishing activity, what is fishing? Fishing is a food production activity. What is farming? Farming is a food production activity, right? Inevitably, both types of food production, all types of food production, are going to have some impact on the natural environment. So if you don't accept that, you're a fool. It's inevitable. So that's the first premise that you need to think about. The second question is, to what extent is it sustainable or not? And this comes down to the environmental context of where the fishing actually occurs. So, fishing is not uniformly distributed across the sea. Fishermen go back to the same locations year in, year out. Some years they do, some years they don't. But they don't just fish, willy-nilly at random around the sea. They have particular features that they're following, and obviously they know where they, will catch fish successfully year on year. Of course, what that does is it tends to aggregate fishing in a relatively smaller proportion of the seabed. So if fishermen were fishing everywhere, it would actually be a disaster, but they don't. So they fish in certain locations. So the perspective I have on that is that's like thinking about those areas as being marine food production areas. So we should think about them as food production seascapes. Yes, they will be modified. Where it's not sustainable is when you've got things that are living on the seabed that, take 20 or 30 years to recover, or they're very, very slow growing, or they're very rare. And obviously that's when we use conservation zones to protect them. Don't go fishing there. It's a no-brainer. But when we've got, I always show whenever I give a talk, I always show a picture of the seafront at Aberystwyth on the coast of Wales. When we had a huge storm come in, and most of the seabed was actually in the front living rooms of all the people who had houses along the prom. Or another time, somebody sent me a huge photograph of a huge wreck of shellfish, crabs, you name it, all thrown up by a storm. So, you have these areas where natural disturbance will have a really big effect. Now, it's not that fishing has no impact, but the point is that the animals that live in areas that are used to getting lots of natural disturbance will be better able to cope with additional, disruption from fishing activity. So they're the areas that, it's if you're going to focus your fishing activity somewhere, focus it there. And we have the information from doing all that work now. We can say which areas of the sea are vulnerable, which areas are resilient to fishing. So we can inform management about that. So that's a good place to be in. The other side of it is, well, can we change the way we fish? So can we, instead of using otter doors, for example, can we use semi-pelagic doors? So they still keep the net open, but they're not ploughing their way through the seabed. That's one way you can reduce disturbance. The other project that we're involved in at the moment is trying to lift scallop dredges off the bottom by fitting them with skids so that the belly bag isn't scraping along the seabed. And actually what that also does is it reduces fuel consumption as well, because you're reducing the friction and abrasion. So that's a win-win for the environment, the fishermen, and the atmosphere as well.
That's an interesting point. But one of the things that the fishermen feel, certainly the scallop dredgers and the bottom trawlers feel, is, and this is not directed at you, but it's certainly taken it to my mind, is that it's mostly the NGOs, and they'll have things online and places about this damage that it does to the seabed. Now, I'm not contradicting what you said there, but what I do know is the biggest bone of contention with the fishermen is all they hear about the damage to the seabed, and yet there's millions of tons of aggregate dredged for the building industry, millions of tons in a year, and nobody ever mentions anything about that.
Sure thing, but Jim, at the end of the day, that's a very, very small area of the seabed that they're impacting. I know it's a very intense. Of course, it's very intense. They're actually hoovering up the seabed, but it's concentrated in a tiny area compared to the actual area that we're actually fishing. But I mean, yeah, it's very easy to show emotive pictures, after a beam trawl's gone through. Well, guess what? It doesn't look very pretty after a combine harvester's gone through a nice field of wheat. Nobody's running into the field afterwards showing you all the little chopped up bodies of field mice and dead crickets and God knows what else. So what I think is always really interesting is how the general public somehow see the marine environment in a totally different way to the way they perceive the land environment. You don't see people lining up in protest as a combine harvester's about to set to and harvest the corn.
Because we can't see it.
Well, no, they just know that they're used to it. They're used to the combine harvester. We've been born, we can see. Well, yes, you're right. Sorry, they can't see it.
You both of you are talking about scallop dredging, but like to my understanding, scallop dredging on a sandy bottom is doing no damage, or much less damage than scallop dredging on coral, because coral can be up to like almost 1,000 years old. They're taking 1,000 years to recover. Isn't there a big definition between where scallop dredging is being conducted and not? Doesn't that make all the difference?
Well, that was exactly the point that I was making, that the effect of that scallop dredging is entirely dependent on the type of seabed environment in which it occurs. So you're right, sandy seabed, minimal impact, very quick recoverability. Blind Bay is a classic example. It's bedrock, it's covered in sea fans. They're not 1,000 years old, but it will take them between 15 and 20 years to recover from that effect. Now, so it's a no-brainer, really, but it's still actually a relatively small area. So, but to be quite frank with you, I don't believe that fishermen go into an area with the intent to kill sea fans. They go into an area with the intent to catch scallops. So again, part of the problem here is we don't have perfect information. In the same way, the fishing industry don't have perfect information. When you think that most people are working with an echo sounder, which just shows you what the seabed topography looks like in a tiny beam under the hull of your vessel. It's not telling you what is either side where your dredges and your beam trawls are. So our actual knowledge of what is actually there is still so limited. And actually, what we found in the Isle of Man, when you furnished fishermen with much more information about where scallops were distributed, they would be much more efficient in the way they went about fishing, and they created much less environmental damage.
Yeah, see, the methods of fishing, one of the other bones, going back to the IUU and this foreign boats, one of the biggest another bone of contention with the Scottish fishermen is the fact that it's all long line and gill netting. And the only people, and I can say this by myself, and I've been over the years, been in many, like the North ports where a lot of that boats land, be it Allapool, Lochinver, Scrabster, and the only people I've almost ever seen, apart from an odd occasion, taking the disused gill net and longline ashore are Scottish boats, and have picked it up in their trawl. That foreign boats just dump it and don't take it in. And the real worry for the Scottish fishermen is, as you know, the nets and the lines, they're continuing their ghost fishing or rogue fishing, whatever you call it. And it's monofilament gear that never rots. So it's continuing to fish and kill fish. And I'm taking it a stage further. I remember I with the Marine Conservation Society, they asked me to come on board and give my thoughts on things, which I agreed to do because I felt if I could put a message across for my knowledge. And for years I was at them about it, and they had I haven't just seen it lately, but whether it's changed, but they have this traffic light system, red, green, amber and green. Red, a species that is red, it's unsustainable, don't touch it. Amber, the stalks are reasonable, but don't overdo it. Green, the stalks are good, eat as much as you want. And they had monkfish. Monkfish is okay in moderation if it is mature and gill net caught. And I said to them for years, it's the most damaging form of fishing. That just shouldn't be. Nothing I said made any difference to them. And they never ever changed that. And I just,
I think, well, I mean, at the end of the day, though, Jim, it depends on the provenance, so where that monkfish has come from. So, I mean, I would have thought any UK vessel using those techniques would be fishing in a responsible way. I think I'm aware of the issue that you're talking about. We're actually talking about IUU vessels fishing outside the 200-mile territorial EEZ, where, of course, they're in international waters and they're fishing on the continental slope that goes down so they're fishing in deep water, sort of, what was that, 4 to 600 meters deep or something like that. And those vessels, because they are fishing illegally, are going to sea with more netting than they could ever bring back because they wouldn't have any fish, and they're not interested in bringing it back. So that's been highlighted in a number of reports, and that is horrendous. The problem is, if it's occurring in international waters, there's very, very little we can do about it because it's outside our jurisdiction. If it's happening inside the UK, then that's disgraceful. And again, it's an enforcement issue. But then, you could say that one way of tightening this up would be, I mean, we have very little insight about ghost fishing gear. So, and undoubtedly one of the worst culprits for that will be deep water gill nets, right? But then why are we not introducing some sort of sensible system whereby you have to declare how many nets you've bought and then return them? If they're useless, return them. If you lose them, say you lose them. But then there should be some conditions about, how many nets it's acceptable to lose in any 1 year. But I mean, the IUU vessels, they're not interested in any of that. And because they're breaking the law anyway and operating illegally, they don't give a damn. So it is horrendous. I don't have a solution for you. But again, I think it comes, but within our waters, it would be good to see a bit more ambition, around some of these things. These things are not difficult to do. For example, a thing I've repeatedly suggested is you need to bring the net manufacturers into this. Why do we not barcode net ropes, headline and foot lines? You have a barcode, you bought it, you return it.
Or GPS tags. Every 12th mesh panel, they cost nothing. That you're right, it's a lack of ambition.
There is regulation in place, because the floats and the dans that the nets, they're meant to have the boat's name on them.
No. So they're the markers, and of course they're the expensive bit, Jim. So of course they bring those back. But it's about the accountability of the gear that you bought. The other thing is, if you had accountability for the amount of gear that was bought, you would get some indication of how much equipment is actually out in the sea ghost fishing. And we have absolutely no understanding of that at the moment whatsoever. I mean, I'll just give you an example. I'm doing a project at the moment in Vietnam. We're working extensively with fishing communities. We did over 500 questionnaires with fishing communities. Every single time they go fishing, they have plastic waste in their fishing equipment. One of the biggest forms of fishing waste, of course, is fishing gear. We were getting stories coming back in our questionnaire surveys where they are losing huge amounts of time with gear wrapped around propellers. If they can't fix it at sea, they're being towed back in. But also horrific stories of crew being sort of told to go over the side, untangle the propeller, and then, because the skipper's left it in neutral, they get chopped up. So there's a real human cost to all of this, effectively what is irresponsible activity. But we can't say, we have to be very careful. That's a small minority of fishing businesses, many of which are illegal, that are doing this sort of thing.
Do you have a way to estimate for ghost fishing in your quota assessments or stock assessments?
The only example I know where they make any attempt whatsoever to try and understand that is in Canada, where they actually, they've worked with the industry themselves knew it was an issue. This was with lobster creels and sort of snow crab creels with these big stainless steel structures, so they're not going to rot down. And of course, they're quite valuable. But so they go out every year and they have a voluntary sort of grappling program where they go out and try and drag up as many. So they would actually have some insight into what was being lost. But the point is it's the industry themselves recognized and were quite clear about the problem. They knew they had a problem. They owned it, if you like, and then, work with the scientists to try and, do something about it.
If tomorrow the Scottish fishing industry and the Scottish government decided to do just as we said, whereby before a boat leaves the port, a monitoring officer identifies how many nets are on board the boat when it leaves, and they come back, how many nets are on board the boat when it comes back, at its simplest level, can we insist that Spanish, French and Portuguese boats conform to that, or can't we? How would that work now Brexit's occurred?
Well, I'm not an expert on this because we're talking about the legality of it, but I would have thought that was the whole point of Brexit. Weren't we getting back control? So doesn't that mean if we're permitting people to fish, if we're allowing people to fish in our waters, that they have to conform to any rules and regulations that we require? That's really the way it should be going.
It seems like a very simple solution, and the question must come is who's responsible for that in Scotland that doesn't just switch that on tomorrow, because that's a very simple solution.
Yeah, but I'm not sure whether... Well, so fishing, of course, is a reserved matter. Whether it actually extends to legislative powers in relation to international fleets, I don't know. So you would need to invite another expert onto your podcast who could talk about, what is and isn't possible under law. Or somebody like Bryce Stewart at the University of York, who's written quite extensively on these sort of issues.
I would say 100% agree with what Michael said, and all I would add to that is when he mentioned Brexit, the Scottish fishermen feel we lost the best of Brexit and we're left with the worst parts of it.
Yep, fishing industry got done over again. Well, I'm not going to make any political comment.
Who do you vote for, Michael? No.
I know. I mean, I thought the whole thing was. I thought it was. Well, I found the whole thing very depressing personally. I know there are lots of fishermen that voted for Brexit. There are lots of farmers that voted for Brexit. Lots of farmers now are regretting voting for Brexit, because one thing that people, I mean, and I've said this many times before, it's all very well having lots of fish to catch. You've got to be able to sell them, and some of the pain that we saw, particularly with the live products going out from Scotland to Spain, suddenly then we had look at the bottleneck. I mean, we've created so many problems, so many barriers to flow of trade. People have lost kind of sight of the fact that seafood is the world's most complex and biggest global market, one of the most sophisticated global markets. Seafood is traded everywhere. When you think about where our products go from the UK, it's phenomenal. And what we've done overnight is we've introduced a whole host of barriers. And then you have something political like the Russian war. Suddenly you can't sell your mackerel to Russia, for example, or, Ukraine's in the middle of a war. So these are real big shocks to the system. I think, I mean, I fully understand why fishermen were frustrated with Europe. But what a lot of fishermen don't realise was that Europe never dictated to the UK government how quota was allocated. It was the UK government that decided how it was going to do the system it was going to put in place to allocate quota. So a lot of inshore fishermen's frustration with what they perceived to be a European imposition was the fact that they weren't being given quota. But that was a decision taken by DEFRA. I mean, I remember when that controversy was going on, it was all over Fishing News. Nobody was listening. Nobody was listening. So yeah, anyway, we are where we are. We now need to make the best of it. We have some opportunities to move forward, but again, where we've got the opportunities, let's be ambitious. And I still think that things are moving along at far too slow a pace. I think the industry is hungry for change. The scientific community is ready to go. Just be good to see government actually get on board and really get their finger out.
Taking it towards the end of the conversation, I'd like to ask you, I believe you're a sea angler, am I right?
In the past, I have. I definitely was an avid angler. I used to lie in bed at night dreaming about it. That's how sad a person I was.
I was a sea angler for 20 years, stopped 10 years ago, so I'm in exactly the same boat. But I'd like to ask you, where's your marks? Are you a Devon guy, or where do you fish?
Good point. Well, since I've spent most of my time around Wales, North Wales coast is very good for sea bass. So I do like wasting a considerable amount of time trying to catch bass, which are very good at eluding me. But I got very friendly with a guy called Mike Ladle, who was the first really strong advocate of using artificial plugs, lures, to fish for sea bass. So, where you'd go down in a really rocky cove, so you just skim these plugs over the top rocks rather than using peeler crabs. I don't know. I mean, it's just, I love going fishing because when you're fishing, you clear your head of all that other rubbish in your life, which would be work and work stress related to work and things like that. And it's just, going down to the shore, watching that heron flying along just as the sun's rising, and maybe seeing an otter or something like that, coming down to the shore. You can't beat it. I mean, kind of catching the fish is sort of secondary. I mean, it's great if you catch some fish. I love eating fish, of course. I think the biggest bass I ever caught at the time was a complete fluke because I was having a piss further up the shore and my rod was bouncing down towards the sea. So eventually I grabbed hold of my rod, and guess what? There was a nice 6-pound bass on the end of it. So I can't even claim any skill, I'm afraid.
That's fishing.
No, I definitely realised my limitations as an angler. If you relied on any catches that I produced, you would assume that the whole place was a desert,
And me as well. There's two types of people. There's people who love going fishing, and there's people who catch fish. I'm of the
Yeah, I know. I think one of the most funny interviews we ever did with a fisherman, I don't want to identify who they are by telling you where it was. Anyway, it was within the UK. And we said to this fisherman, Why do you go fishing every morning at 3 a.m., even if the tide is coming in and you're pushing the tide? He said, well, I just like to get away from the wife. So it's an appalling thing to say, but it just goes to show you can never make assumptions of why people do what they do. And when you're working with humans, it makes life, A, more interesting, but B, an awful lot more complicated as well.
Yeah, because fishermen suffer, like every industry, they suffer confirmation bias, where somebody who's earning money from an industry has a tendency, following cognitive bias, to believe only the evidence that supports their side of it. And, there's a lot of that exists naturally. So, as you said, it's only science that can really deliver the facts. All of the anecdotal evidence in the world isn't really going to get us anywhere.
But fishermen can be key to helping us deliver more of those facts going forward in the future.
That's certainly the message that's come loud and clear with me today with this conversation, because knowing so many fishermen as well as I do, and hearing what you're saying, Michael, it's got to happen. It's not. I think it spurs it on, and I think there's going to be a few fishermen proactive in this, and when they hear what you're saying, I'm absolutely convinced that there will be some action taken to get you closer.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for your time and for joining us in the episode, and hope we'll have you back on again in the future.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Nothing I like more than talking about the fishing industry, fishermen, and discussing it with a bunch of fishermen.
And I ask each person now, before we close up, if you just say you had been fishing or on a harbour or that, what would your take-home fish be, and what would you do with it?
Ooh, well, that's a nice choice to have. My take-home fish. What would it be?
I'm gonna answer this one too. That's a question for the both of us. So let's see what we come out with here.
Okay, my take-home fish, I would probably be a monkfish. I would skin it, obviously. Some nice big sort of fillet or steak of it. Wrap it in some pancetta. Put some herbs in, bit of lemon juice, bit of white wine. Bake that off in the oven. Serve it on top of some puy lentils with nice chorizo, and which I poached in red wine, and that is lovely.
Mine is a mackerel. I would take it home, clean its arse, wrap it in tinfoil, and eat it. It's just that simple. The finest fish in the North Sea.
Do you know? I also, yes, that also could have been an answer for me. One of the most underrated, undervalued fish going, and one of the cheapest fish.
I'll never forget when I was running a restaurant, the Captain's Galley, and I was speaking to this guy at his table, and he says we're talking about fish, obviously, and he says the best experience, the most memorable experience he had as eating fish was concerned. Obviously, this was before he ate at the Captain's Galley, but he said he was out fishing. They were catching mackerel. He said they had a small boat. They had tin foil. They wrapped the mackerel in the foil and strapped it to the manifold of the engine and cooked it.
Yeah, that would do it.
And cooked it.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'm sorry, there is no chef in this world that'll emulate that. This is when you think you're out there in the sea in a small boat close to the water and catching fish, no stress. There's no chef in the world that'll match that.
No, that's true. Yeah. I mean, the sad thing about mackerel, of course, it deteriorates so quickly, doesn't it? After you caught it, it's literally you're on a like a stopwatch to get to eat it. Really.
I know it's going to happen after this podcast. Somebody in London is going to put on their menu manifold baked mackerel at sea. You watch.
Anyway, nice to meet you, Ashley. Lovely to meet you,
Thank
Jim.
you. Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for listening to Seafood Matters podcast. You can subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcast. You can join me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook by searching for @Seafood Matters Podcast, or get in touch with me through my website, www.seafoodmatterspodcast.com.